I think if you like signed up to slop the deck or whatever, you could get a pretty good deal.
Dan and I are both very, very eager to speak with you because there's definitely a big center to the Venn diagram, but we're also very aware of the parts that do not overlap in the things that you spend your time looking at and the things that we spend our time looking at.
Welcome to the Wagner's Nightmare podcast. If you like what you're hearing in this episode, you can follow us on Instagram and Facebook, and you can go to our website to find essays, videos, and musical performances related to the topics in all of these podcast episodes. Just a quick apology in advance to my dear, beloved Daniel Orsen, who I forgot to introduce until too late into this podcast. So he is there, even though his dulcet voice does not appear until about the 5th or the 6th minute. Hope you enjoy.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the third episode of Wagner's Nightmare. We are super stoked to have with us today Benjamin Crowe, professor of philosophy at my alma mater, Boston University. I don't know what building you're in right now, but I definitely recognize the architecture. It kind of looks like 855 Com Ave. I don't know if you're in there,
Yeah, I'm very
but
close. I'm in 745 Com Ave.
okay, okay,
So I'm just down the street from there. Yeah. Uh,
nice.
this is the School of Theology building.
Oh,
Believe
okay,
it or not. Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I spent a little time in there myself. But on to other things. We are here to talk about German idealism and German philosophy, which is a very related subject to Wagner and his whole world, not least of all because of his close friendship and later fiery non-friendship with Nietzsche. And I will let Ben say a little bit more about himself and kind of what he's up to at BU and what he's up to outside of BU. And yeah,
Great. Well, this is great. I'm really excited to be here. Looking forward to this. I was really happy when I got the invite. So yeah. Just briefly about me, so we could get on to the real discussion. Like I work on German idealism primarily in terms of my kind of research and writing. And I do teach that from time to time. And then I also teach other kind of more introductory level classes for our department. And so that's a lot of fun because sometimes the students have never really done or thought about philosophy before. And, when they get kind of into it, I do feel like I've corrupted them, but in a good way. That's kind of gratifying. So, yeah, I mean, it occurred to me that I think I'm lucky because like what my job is and what I want to be doing are the same thing. So I know many of us are not fortunate enough to enjoy that synchronicity. So yeah, I just got back from Chicago for about a week and a half ago for like 4 days of nonstop idealism. DePaul University hosted the North American Fichte Society.
wait, let me stop you there. I
Yeah.
also that's my that's where I did my
That's your other
undergrad.
alma mater is
Yeah,
DePaul?
yeah, yeah, yeah. My
No
the
way.
as you were
This
talking
is too
about
weird.
as
This
you
is
were
too
talking
weird.
about being corrupted by philosophy teachers, for me it's William McNeill, Professor William McNeill,
Okay.
who was a
Yeah, yeah.
Heidegger specialist, and
That's
I've
right. I met him a few times actually at
okay.
these kind of things when people were sharing their work and stuff. It's been a while, but
Oh,
wow.
what a
Okay.
relief! When you said Chicago, I was like, oh no, he went to U Chicago. No, he went to Northwestern. And
Yeah,
no, DePaul.
Northwestern. No, it was DePaul. No, they were very generous to us. It was quite a big meeting, and it was fun. There were the best part about the North American Fichte Society is that we typically meet in like Korea or Portugal or Austria, and occasionally we actually come to the United States. So the only thing that makes it North American is that it's all in English language. So, Yeah, so that was fun. So, I've been thinking before I have this sort of break in the summer, in the first part of the summer, before I have to work on class for the fall. And so I'm thinking about philosophy as we speak. So, yeah, so that's me in a nutshell.
Fantastic. Well, why don't we kind of dip our toes in the water here? I think that probably a fair amount of the people here listening maybe are not as up to snuff as they wish they were on German idealism. And I definitely have one question. We have this terminology problem in the music that we play, which is classical music, which is like, okay, what does that mean, classical music? And first there's like the wider genre, but then there's the period of classical music, which stands apart from Baroque or Romantic music. So could you just basically say German idealism, what what does it stand apart from? Are there non-idealists? What kind of comes? Who are they trying to stand
Yeah,
out
yeah,
from?
that's a good question. That's a good question. So, one way to kind of tell the story of German idealism is to stands apart from kind of early modern philosophy to a certain extent, or it's sort of new. And the real point at which you can maybe locate that is with Immanuel Kant. And the key thing, really, I mean, to summarize something super complicated, of course, is basically this new understanding of the mind, reason as active, as like as a faculty of spontaneity, creativity, freedom, and what Kant had argued is that basically various kind of impasses, debates about mind and body, about free will and determinism, about whether God exists or not, things like that, had been going on for a while. And all of them, the reason they were kind of interminable is because people didn't understand this point he's making about how the concepts that we use are kind of created by our mind in a way that shapes our experience and puts limits on it as well. And so when people try to go beyond those limits, then they start talking about nonsense, basically. And so there's always going to be interminable debate at that level. So that's what Kant said. And he said it's like the Copernican revolution in astronomy,
Mhm.
where it went from the Earth to the sun being the center. Here, it's like the from the external world, um, and the physical world to the mind,
Mhm.
basically like the our mental faculties kind of become the basis for explaining everything else.
Yeah. What's funny when I hear you talking about that is that I I immediately think of you know, what it sounds like to me is something like Mozart in the Magic Flute and kind of these ideals and kind of this classical period, this very
Mm-hmm.
formal music,
Mm-hmm.
and then with not very flexible characters, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and somebody like Schumann, where only 40 years later is writing music that's completely about what's going on in him and the contradictions and this irrationality of
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I think there's something to be said connecting this in Copernican revolution by Kant with what came later in terms of romantic culture and thought and music. Absolutely. That there, what people began to appreciate more than Kant himself did was the role of imagination and feeling in the way our minds actively create our experience, and kind of our world basically. And so Kant didn't appreciate that as much, right? He's
Hmm.
kind of Mozart, maybe
Hmm.
Haydn,
Hmm.
I think is kind of Kant. There are rules, and being free involves following rules. because then you're free from the kind of distorting influence of emotion, desire, natural inclinations, things like that. That
And
was
then
Kant, and obviously that is sort of aesthetic outlook didn't last. It changed. Yeah, definitely.
Dan, do you want to?
I want to jump in. Yeah. I
First of
exist
all,
too.
this is
I've
Daniel.
been
This is
lurking around.
this
Yeah.
is Daniel Orsen. You might know him from previous episodes. He's been here the whole time.
Oh yes. So this phrase German idealism, does it have any connection to Plato's idea of the idea?
Okay, that's a really good question. So, the German idealists themselves, wanted to point out some connection, for sure. Perhaps a loose way to explain the connection is, if you're thinking about Plato, the thought is what's real is the universal, which we can only grasp with our intellect, with our reason. And because we can't have knowledge of things that change all the time and so forth. And so, since things here, like down here in our world, change all the time, there must be kind of another domain where these eternal things exist. So, what the German idealists shared is the idea that kind of real knowledge of things and kind of basic judgments about value require that there be these kind of ideal concepts, these kind of pure universal concepts. But instead of locating them in like a different dimension, as Plato did, they are the products of our own mind's activity. And like at its deepest level, the way that our mind organizes reality, for example, might require the idea that there's kind of one being who sums it all up and contains the basis for everything else. That idea, like the idea of God or Plato's idea of the good, is something that the idealists want to ascribe to reason rather than to a realm of forms. Yeah.
And
So
then does that, sorry, Nicholas, I got to ask, does that, is that become then a subjective thing, or can it still be an objective thing? Is it, somewhere in my reading, I got, one of those people thought that it was shared in everybody's brain somehow, but it was all
Yeah.
the same thing. They kind of had like this, the human mass mind was a, the hive mind, I guess, was a thing, or is it really an
Yeah.
individual thing?
Yeah. So that's a really super good question, right? And that's kind of what they sort of faced, right? What is the relationship between these ideas and kind of the natural world, and that we experience, right? And us as particular individuals. And so this is where the German idealists divided amongst themselves in terms of how they wanted to account for that.
and when you say German idealist, does this includes Kant or this is post Kant?
I think it's safe to say it includes Kant.
Okay,
Some may get upset with me for saying that.
okay.
But the idealists thought that they were kind of saying what Kant really wanted to say if he had like thought about it more carefully. And so, in that sense, he is one of them. Yeah.
Okay.
And so they divided on this question, right? About is this just subjective, like in a sense that makes it relative to like my experience or like an individual's experience? And they wanted to say no, but they came up with different ways to try to answer that, right? So one thought was that nature itself is this kind of primitive rational principle that unfolds itself in reality, not too distant from the idea of evolution, not too far away from that, except the idea is there's one unified absolute that unfolds itself
And
into.
who would that idea kind of
So that
be?
idea is especially associated with Schelling and also to a certain extent with Hegel. That
The
was
dialectic
a
kind of?
solution. Yeah. Whereas Fichte wanted to say you have to start at the top. So the thing you have to explain is like my individual brain, not the universal ideas. So that's a lot more like Plato, right? That you start with the universal thing, and then you have to tell a story about how it gets like turned into particular stuff. Uh, and so he thought it couldn't start with nature for various reasons. Schelling and Hegel said it has to. And yeah, so that was kind of a place where they divided up on basically that very question that you asked, Dan.
And what's ideal about all of this?
So what makes it called idealism? So it's funny that like I've never been clear about that. Like because different people explain it different ways. A lot of times in philosophy when we say idealism, we mean a view that says something is mind dependent. Like so maybe just to take an example, like you could be an idealist about flavors, where you thought that like nothing is sweet or sour or bitter unless I sort of perceive it that way, basically. So a lot of people think that that is part of what their thought is, right? That reality is the product of our mind rather than the interaction between our mind and body, something like that. Others want to say, no, it's not that idealism at all. It's this more Plato related thing that says there are these ideas that are like necessary thoughts that organize reality as far as we can tell, right? As far as our experience goes. Um, so I don't know why they're called the German idealists, and they didn't always consistently call themselves that.
Hmm.
Um,
I guess a follow-up question for me would be if is it more idea or is it more ideal? Because the whole idea thing is kind of epistemological, kind of like just an idea of knowledge and these kinds of what knowledge is, or
right.
ideal has some sort of qualitative, um, again, that idea of the good and this kind of like moral path. And I guess is it heading more in a phenomenological, epistemological route, or is it heading more in a moral, ideal path or an idea path?
That's a really good question. So there's a debate about a thesis that's sometimes called the primacy of practical reason. So practical reason is the reason that deals with the ideal in the sense that you were talking about, right? Like what's good, what's best for what's the best world, how should it be, right? And so there's a debate about like who held the view that that is in fact the most important thing actually, right? It's that there are questions about the good and what ought to be, and in order to answer those questions we construct a theory about nature and about other stuff, right? The epistemological theory, in order to really explain this unshakable sense that we have kind of a moral calling or a moral nature, that we cannot doubt, we ought not to doubt. If we doubt it, we are like disrespecting ourselves, something like that. So all of these guys had that sort of conviction. And for them, it was all about freedom, all about freedom. So when Kant said the mind is active, they said, "Wow, freedom, right? Like that's what you've given us an explanation of and kind of a theoretical foundation for thinking about." So they wanted to answer both things that you described, right? They wanted to
Mhm.
explain how knowledge is possible and all that good stuff. But I mean, on a certain sense, what they really cared about was the ideal. Yeah.
Mm. Sounds really intense. Sounds
It
like
is
these.
intense. These were all intense people, right? These
Yeah.
none of these guys. Some say that Hegel was like okay, like you could hang out with Hegel, get a beer with him or whatever, and he was had a sort of a more friendly manner about him. But these other guys were not
Yeah.
like that. They were. It was like it was intense. It was
Okay.
all or nothing.
Pretty full on.
It was, for example, Fichte was accused of being atheist. He thought unjustly. And so instead of trying to like kind of be political about it, he accused the other guys of being atheists. And the other
Okay.
guys happened to be the people who were in charge of the consistory, which is like the Lutheran administrative thing in Germany. And they were
Mhm.
like, no, we're not. You can't say that. So you just lost your job, Fichte. And so these were guys that like just were not capable of compromise with anyone about anything.
Mhm.
And so they really were intense. Yeah. And the
Yeah.
same thing goes for the kind of the next generation, the romantics were also intense people, right? They too took these ideas and tried to like put them into practice. Like, what's the ideal community like?
Mm.
I don't know. Let's like make one amongst ourselves, kind of.
Yeah,
Um,
I guess, and just to thinking, okay, we're musicians here, and the terms of like romantic and all this kind of stuff, especially romanticism, I think has different launch points depending on what subject you're talking about. And I think
yeah.
like for musicians, it's kind of around 1820, and I suspect that I mean 1820, I'm putting it at like late Beethoven, the beginning of late Beethoven and late Schubert,
Okay.
when Schumann's a teenager. I don't know. Like this is about probably when romanticism in music starts happening.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
and so where kind of what neck of the woods are you talking about here?
So there in philosophy, and I think a distinction of periods of romantic were like come up with too, right? And so the initial guys who really like took the torch from Kant, Fichte, and Schelling and them were kind of the early romantics, they're called. And so these were guys like Friedrich Schlegel and his brother, like poet and author of fairy tales Ludwig Tieck, like the poet Novalis, and the poet Hölderlin. And so this was more of a literary uptake, I guess I would say. Though, of course, many of these guys' poems later became famous Lieder that were pieces of music. But initially, they were literary figures, but it right away was like an aesthetic thought, right? They said we've got to get these ideals to people
And
through
this is probably
art.
like 20 to 40 years before the 1820s. This is like the end of the
Yeah,
1700s.
we're talking late 1790s,
Yeah.
right? It was
Okay.
like it was sort of like the summer of love, right? It
Uh-huh.
only lasted for like a couple of years. Like all these people that were super smart and creative came
Uh-huh.
together, and there was
Oh
like
my
this
God.
explosion of creativity. And then they all were involved in love triangles and
Uh-huh.
stuff. And so it broke apart, right? And none of them had a real job. And so they were like running from creditors and things. And so,
Wait, that's such a thing. I don't know if people running from creditors these days, or at least we're not told
right.
about them. But Wagner was a guy, like he was an outright thief. He would get debt up the wazoo in a city and then run away to another one. Um,
Yeah, that's really
was that
funny. I didn't know that about Wagner.
was that a sociological thing back then? Was it like a
Well, I
matter of
mean,
pride?
it was, I think, partly because it was still a very stratified society, and there were like dukes and people like that, and industrialists who were super rich, and then there was everybody else. And most of these figures who made an impact on culture came from the lesser people, not like the impoverished, destitute people, but the professional class, the people who got an education. but they were still lived hand to mouth if they couldn't get some kind of official appointment, like a government job, basically, or a job in the church, or like they became the official court composer of the Archbishop of such and such, that sort of thing, right? And so then the advantage was like Germany was all fragmented, right? So like if you owed people stuff in like Hessen Kassel, you just like cross a stream and you're in a different country and they can't get you there. And so that's why they moved around all the
Yeah.
time, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's that. I think it's because money was only available for like rich Philistines,
Yeah.
and creative types tended to be in the starving artist category for the most
So
part.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think that kind of all of the things that we've been talking about right now can kind of organically take us to this big Wagnerian and wider European date of 1848.
Right.
And this kind of,
Can we backtrack just a little for my own sanity here?
yep,
Just to
well,
kind of like tidy things up. So the German idealism, that would start roughly what year, and with Kant as the major figure?
Roughly 1780 is the
Okay.
start date.
And then the major figures in that are Kant and Schelling, you said?
Fichte, yeah, and Schelling and Hegel. And
Okay.
Hegel
And
died in 1831, actually. And so even though Schelling was still around for a while after that, that was kind of the end of it. That was kind of the end.
and then there's this transition to the early Romantic period in philosophy.
Right.
Around what time roughly? 1800, you said?
The very late 1790s. It was like a younger generation of people, but still born in the 18th century primarily. Yeah. And then those guys died / got old and uninteresting. And you got another generation of romantic artists in literature, like E.T.A. Hoffman, for example. Um, and I think that's where it became musical. It was that.
exactly,
That's
yeah.
when Romanticism entered music.
Yeah,
Wagner was born
ETA,
in sorry, I was speaking over you. Wagner was born in 1813, so that's
Okay. Yes. Wow, that's really interesting. That's like the same time period as like Marx and Kierkegaard and
exact
yeah.
same year as Kierkegaard, and the exact same year as Nietzsche's father, actually.
okay,
They were all
okay.
born the same year. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know that Wagner was that of that vintage. Somehow, I guess I thought he was born later. Okay.
And then, well,
Anyway,
there's also that it's kind of this nexus here around 1810, 1813, and then in 1808 there's the premiere of the of Beethoven 5, Fifth Symphony, which E.T.A. Hoffman wrote a rather famous review of that is kind of a I don't know, the OG primary source, I guess, of like musical romanticism and like kind of
okay.
when we start talking about romanticism, this would probably be if you were teaching music instead of philosophy, the thing that you'd give to your introductory class would probably be E.T.A. Hoffman's review.
Ah,
Because
very interesting.
incidentally, because it's not so much a review, but uh, an experiential description of the piece. Of
Okay.
so
Okay.
kind
Kind of
of
how it was supposed to work, kind of on the.
how like kind of what it inspired in him
Okay.
and the effect that the piece had on him. It wasn't
Wow, that's really
necessarily,
interesting.
yeah.
I didn't know that. So 1808, I mean, this is a huge period in German history because this is when Napoleon was defeated, and the idea of like German nationhood as a modern concept
Mhm.
dates from around then.
Well, I would also say defeated the first time.
Defeated the first time, right? He
Yeah.
came back for like a second go, and then he was defeated
Right.
again. Yeah, that's right.
And yeah, Waterloo was the second
And
time.
so this is when the fragmentation of Germany started to come to an end, and it became started to become a modern country. And so this identification of idealism and romanticism in art, music, culture, philosophy, literature, this all of this really was tied in with that. And it was like this super exciting, kind of mind blowing time, right? People trying to really define themselves in terms of ideas in a way that no one had, people didn't really consciously do that before, you know, culture just kind of happened,
Hmm.
you know, and here there were people that were like, we're going to invent a national culture based on philosophy and these artistic ideas and stuff. Yeah. So,
I think what's cool about that too is that it's happening on the micro and the macro level. That you have, like you say, people, like real individuals, like I have an idea, but they're talking about a nation at the same time, you know?
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So part of it, I mean, one thing that I think is especially relevant to Wagner and maybe Nietzsche's early enthusiasm for Wagner is the way that they were all captivated by ancient Greece. And there were different things that they liked about it. You know, different people like different stuff about it. But one thing that they liked about it was that it seemed to them in their imagination like it was this uniquely unified culture, right? Like, you know how now everyone's into their own thing, right? You can
mhm,
do whatever religion you want or none,
mhm.
you know, everyone's doing their own thing, right?
Yeah.
And these German intellectuals and artists and writers and so forth, they really thought there was something about the way Greek society, like Athens, classical Athens, was this kind of unified thing. Like the whole, all the people and the leaders and everything kind of shared this common ethos. Yeah, something like that. And this idea came from Herder, another person who's musically important because he recorded a lot of folk songs that were later put to music by Schubert, at least I know. But Herder had the idea that instead of history being like this progress from like primitive to way better, each era had its own kind of ethos, right? Like each society had its own like unifying mentality that tied everybody together. And they
Mhm.
thought that,
He's the
and these Germans thought they needed that. They needed that for their country.
Mhm.
is he's the guy who coined the folk. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. All this idea of the folk and the Volkslied and the Volksgeist. That was Herder's term for this like unifying cultural mindset. Um,
Mhm.
and so everyone was obsessed with that. And they also thought that part of how it worked was mythology. So like Greek mythology was the thing. So like all philosophers, artists back in Greece, they all had this like common fund of mythological material that they could riff on, basically. But it was like their shared cultural understanding. And so they said, we need a mythology. We need like a modern mythology that's not about like Zeus and his sex life or whatever, but about like, you know, I don't know what they wanted it to be about, but like
Mhm.
they wanted to be appropriate to modern life.
Mhm.
Well, that's the ring. That
Yeah,
was
that's the ring
Wagner's.
cycle.
That was
Yeah,
Wagner's precise mission. That's exactly what he
exactly.
was trying to do.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's a great book. I was looking around here in my dingy office. I was going to plug it, hold it up, you know, and actually show you the cover. But it's called the Longing for Myth in Germany. Let me actually look at the author, and he explores the mythological part. There was a lot more to it. Like there's a lot more about this like fascination with ancient Greece than just a myth part. But George S. Williamson's book, The Longing for Myth in Germany, Religion and Aesthetic Culture from Romanticism to Nietzsche. So it takes it from a kind of history of culture point of view. So yeah, and that's what Nietzsche thought that the ring was going to be. Yeah,
Mhm.
he thought they were going to go and it was going to be amazing and like it would be like the birth of this new unifying spirit. And I guess he thought it sucked. And he was really disappointed. And it just wasn't as cool, right? Like he got his tickets, went to Bayreuth, and I don't know all the ins and outs of this part of the story, but like the world was still pretty much the same
Mhm.
when the concert was finished, basically, and
Yeah.
it was really disappointing to Nietzsche on multiple levels.
Yeah.
But he never really gave up on this idea of like the Greeks being this kind of, cultural pinnacle, that if we could do what they did, but in our own way,
Mhm.
then everything would be great.
Yeah.
But he sort of turned his back on the German. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
yeah. I think he came to think that it was a culture of Philistines and that it was too mired in kind of like commercial life and stuff like that, to really be worthy of undertaking this mission, right? And so, of course, he's like viciously critical of the Germans, right? And he kind of, he even, right, like the sort of beer swilling element of German culture, Nietzsche
Mhm.
really had like almost, I remember someone telling me this about this kind of a, not quite puritanical, but almost kind of feel about that, like straight edge kind
Yeah.
of,
It
he
kind of
was
gets
like,
back
oh,
to,
you Philistines, right? You're like, you can't discuss Wagner if you're drinking swilling beer, right? So
yeah.
get out of here. Yeah.
It kind of circles back to we were calling these how kind of intense and full on these earlier idealists were. Um, and I think that kind of circling back to this whole because we for us it's clear, but we did kind of jump about 50 years from 1820 to like 1860s, 70s
Yes,
time.
yes.
And just that coming back to this 1848, we don't want to get stuck in that kind of massive black hole of a conversation. But in terms of just this particular story of Nietzsche and Wagner, that the year of these revolutions, and this is the year that where these kind of idealistic, some would say failed, some would say disorganized, some would say whatever it is, they had a huge effect. And one of the more basic effects would be just that Wagner was sentenced to die, and then that was lessened. He eventually kind of ran away to Switzerland to avoid suffering the sentence that he would have received. And he stayed in Zurich and eventually Lucerne. And um, that's in Switzerland where he spent a lot of time with Nietzsche.
It's a little more uh, complicated than that. I was figuring out some of the details researching King Ludwig II. Um, Wagner did run away. I think he spent some time in, I forget, I think he spent some time in London and there, but a good bit in Paris, and eventually he got into Switzerland. And then in the 1860s, I think it might have been, somewhere in there, it might have been 1860 precisely. His sentence was lifted in everywhere except Saxony, so he could go into other German states as a free, okay man. And then the king of Bavaria died, and Ludwig became king, and he got in touch with Wagner. And then Wagner came to Bavaria and hung out there for a while. And then Ludwig spent too much money on Wagner and started asking him for state advice, and Wagner was writing the newspapers about what they should do. And the people got mad. And so the king sent Wagner away. He said he would have come with Wagner and given up his kingship, but Wagner didn't want that because it wouldn't have been very helpful to him. So that's when Wagner ended up back in Tribschen near Lucerne and met Nietzsche. Well, first he met Nietzsche in Leipzig at a concert. And Nietzsche was already a huge fanboy. Like he had the score for Tristan before it even came out. And but
Wow.
then he got the job teaching in Basel right after that. And so then he came down to Switzerland, and that's when their relationship really started to gel.
Yeah, so Wagner and the family were there in Lucerne, right, at that
Yeah.
time,
Mm-hmm.
if I remember correctly. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and so that was like in the middle of the 1870s. Does that sound right?
or before
Early
then,
18.
1868, I think, is when Nietzsche
Oh,
moved
okay.
down
So
there.
it was earlier. Okay.
Yes, and
Really
then
interesting. So I did not know that about Wagner. That was precisely what happened. Was these sort of super idealistic younger, typically folks, kind of saw this revolutionary possibility, and then it was defeated in some cases with great violence, and so they all kind of fled for their lives, right? And that included like Marx and Engels, and figures from that world, that kind of radical political thinking world, who themselves were definitely readers of Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, all the boys, right? So that's interesting. I didn't know that Wagner had been sort of swept up in that.
oh yeah, he was buddies with Bakunin back in the, I don't know how to
Okay,
pronounce the
okay,
era. Yeah,
okay. Yeah, interesting.
he had
Okay.
like a copy of Schopenhauer under his arm along the ramparts too
Along the way. Yeah, I bet he liked
in
Schopenhauer.
Dresden.
Yeah.
Oh, he was
Yeah.
huge in Schopenhauer. Yeah.
Well, that's kind of another thing that I maybe also with the connection with Nietzsche and the general context there is partially as a result of the 1848 and when they like cracked down after that failed. There were all these like young, really smart people, and they couldn't get a job in the German states. And in some cases, right, in the case of Wagner, Engels, Friedrich Engels, they were be arrested and put to death, in principle anyway, if they ever set foot back there. So there was thus this sort of, I don't know, this kind of freelance philosophy that developed in that context. And the idea was the revolution failed once again because the Germans were not like culturally unified enough. And they were mired in like this Biedermeier sort of worldview. And philosophy, like art, needed to like get to the people. It needed to like get to like the folks needed to know about the meaning of life and so on. And so the combination of not being able to get an academic job because of their political or religious views and their view about what was really needed to accomplish revolutionary change meant there was just this whole host of guys who all looked to Schopenhauer as an inspiration. Because he too was kind of an outsider, never really had a permanent academic position, but became this kind of cult figure. And all of these future greats would kind of visit Schopenhauer when he was an old man in Frankfurt and kind of show up at his door. And he was very gracious, and they would sit and talk about how great Schopenhauer was, right? So, you can see Nietzsche going that way. I mean, with him, it was partly due to his illness that made it so he was not able to work his regular job. But I mean, he wasn't that sick. He wrote like 12 books in the next decade. He was okay. So, and obviously, Nietzsche books are not normal academic treatises, right?
Right.
They like Thus Spoke Zarathustra is like the Bible of a religion that never existed. It has that reading, kind of feel to it. And so today, the only one of these guys that anyone really knows about and still is very seriously interested in is probably Nietzsche. But there's a great book about them called Weltschmerz, which sums up their general attitude towards life, right? Like literally world pain or suffering, and the idea of kind of being weary of the world, right? And it was huge, and there were all of these people who came in the wake of Schopenhauer, including Nietzsche, who had this thought that like the world didn't make sense anymore, nobody cared, God was dead, we have to invent our new things, we have to invent something new to replace what's gone forever, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the way that you talk about Nietzsche and his philosophical works is kind of also how um, how Wagner works as well, because sure, there are operas with a score, but they're also kind of supposed to be seen as these foundational um, moral, political, cultural agendas almost, or like reference points, synecdoches or something, this kind of like little piece that's supposed to. And I think of something like the Meistersinger, which has a very concrete and tangible idea of what German culture is and what Germanness is. Um, the theme of Germanness in the Meistersinger is something that is very, very concrete. You either have it or you don't. And that's kind of, especially in the last half hour of the opera, that's driven home a lot. Um, and
That's really interesting about the Meistersinger. Yeah, if I might just jump in. So we
yeah,
were
yeah,
going back to the romantic connection, and this figure from the German Middle Ages of what were they called? Minnesingers, or they were like the
exactly.
troubadours of
Yeah.
Germany.
And the Meistersinger
Um,
is set early, much earlier. It's not a
yeah.
contemporarily set opera.
Okay. But it's the subject of it sounds like a similar sort of dude.
Hmm.
And the idea was these romantics were very obsessed with those, right? So Novalis wrote a book called Heinrich von Ofterdingen about one of these guys. Goethe wrote Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre.
Of course.
And there was the idea of like those guys were like they were like the Homeric bards of German culture,
Mm.
authentic folk culture, and they became vehicles to express people's aesthetic ideals, right? You know that like the new troubadours are Wagner or Nietzsche or
Right.
whoever. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and the idea that you were saying that they are like these unifying cultural events, that's
Mhm.
really helpful and important, I think, because they thought of like, well, Nietzsche, of course, famously, but they all thought of like the tragic drama that way, right? That like all the Greeks showed up and watched
Mhm.
Sophocles and like
Mhm.
were like Greekified by that.
Mhm.
And, you know, like sort of their spiritual identity was sort of publicly reaffirmed in
Right.
the tragedies in a
It's
ritualistic way.
yeah,
And
Beethoven.
yeah,
So just it's just so funny because Wagner has basically a similar view, and like one of his longer, it's like about 70 pages, one of his longer essays, just Beethoven, it's called. The first like 30 to 40% of it is just talking about Greek tragedy. And you open the thing, oh, I'm going to learn about Beethoven, and then he's just like talking about dance for the Greeks, text for the Greeks, like all these, just breaking it down, and then eventually talks about Beethoven. Um,
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
also an art and revolution and opera
mhm,
and drama, and he has one on that he wrote for King Ludwig. Ludwig asked him for advice, and he wrote something on the state and religion. That's what it was called. And
Uh-huh.
um, but no, Wagner was the first person. Well, not the first, but he coined Apollonian and Dionysian before Nietzsche, actually,
Okay.
um, or he used it before him.
Okay. So he's
But
definitely on
in
that
the
same wavelength, thinking about this
oh
kind
yeah,
yeah,
of
if anything, I think Nietzsche's on the same wavelength as Wagner.
yeah,
Sort of,
yeah. Okay.
kind of
Yeah.
picking
Yeah.
up
And that
on.
explains, you know, the huge influence and how important Wagner was for Nietzsche, because he really went for that idea all the way. Yeah.
Right? And
Yeah.
Wagner also really strongly articulated this idea of art religion. Um, I mean, in a lot of there's different prose works, but he really saw what he was creating at Bayreuth, I think, as a temple and something that was sacramental for um, the German people, but perhaps not only the German people. I, I think there's a possibility in Wagner for a slightly more open universal thing, but definitely a kind of Germanness that would have to spread to other cultures that was still essentially German. Um, like at the end of The State and Religion, which is about the state and religion, supposedly, like in the last two pages, he makes this turn and he says, The king needs religion because he has all the cares of the state, and religion is necessary for the king. And religion and the state find their nexus in the king. But there's this problem with religion is that it requires a sort of reliance on something that's actually believed to be true or rooted in fact. And art's great because you don't have to deal with that at all. It's not reliant on fact whatsoever. Your concept is that there's an illusion here, but it provides the same exact good as religion. So just don't worry about religion. It's fine, but you don't really need to worry about it. We have art instead, so worry about that, and it'll take care of you.
Like fiction will never be disproved by Darwin or something, right?
Exactly.
But it will still be spiritual and unifying and community making. Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. I would love to. I actually should read that essay. It's called State and Religion. Because it sounds as though an idea that none of these guys would have known about, but which later surfaced from Hegel, was this idea of Volksreligion. And he thought that like Christianity couldn't be one because it emphasized the salvation of the individual. And what you needed was something that was artistic, sort of like the Greek one, that it wasn't about like doctrines that you had to believe in so much as like some kind of symbol that everybody could come together and appreciate. It's a pretty vague idea. But yeah, that's really interesting that Wagner is coming to that same sort of thought. Like this was a thing that Hegel wrote when he was very young, and it just was like in a drawer and was only published, in fact, after both Wagner and Nietzsche had died. So in the early 20th century. So yeah. So I was, we were thinking about the like rupture with Nietzsche and Wagner and like what kind of went on there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
And I think that I was going to kind of bring that back of like, at the beginning here, you were talking about this shift at the end of the 18th century of kind of philosophy being about the external world and kind of explaining that, and then the shift kind of inwards. And we made this kind of parallel between shift from classicism to romanticism in music. And then we kind of jumped 50 years down the line to Nietzsche and Wagner. And this rupture that happened between these two very close friends and intellectual colleagues, part of it is attributed to the fact that Nietzsche saw a kind of disconnect between the ideals and the ethical life that was seen in Wagner's works and the guy himself. And we've mostly been talking about not really ourselves. We've been talking about things 19th century and kind of other people's ideas. And I guess, Ben, I wanted to ask you, if, personally, or as a philosopher, or as a kind of commentator, if you think that it's kind of fair for Nietzsche, how much can we actually live up to our ideals? Is that a weight that we should? How heavily should we bear that burden?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and of course, one that exercised Nietzsche very much. Like in the case of Wagner and his own self. I mean, he was clearly worried about his own self in that regard too. So part of it, maybe, I mean, one brief way to connect it with some of the ideas we've been talking about is this idea of a religion, sort of new religion of art of the people that went together with the thought of the exemplary individual, the genius, right? This is the person who founds that culture. This is the person who not only like paints paintings that are great, but his life is a work of art, right? Like his actual life is the thing that brings everybody else together and unites us all. And because we need, as human beings, we need some kind of tangible, like physical thing to hold on to, right? And so I think Nietzsche is like under the spell of that idea when he rejects Wagner's kind of personal life, right? Issues, that he really thinks that it's not enough for you to have great ideas, right? Like you are the work of art in some sense.
Mhm.
You are the great man, the genius, the almost sort of prophet, almost, right? Like in that same kind of vein. And I gotta say, I think that as a person, I think that's unfair. I would hate for anyone to expect that from me, just for starters. But
Mhm.
I also think it kind of shows where some of these otherwise very inspiring and still kind of gripping ideals, where they kind of get messed up, right? Where when they collide with the facts of human nature, they need to be adjusted somehow in order to not have the Nietzsche Wagner break or
Mhm.
some similar thing, that there's something, as of course Nietzsche came to appreciate much later in the genealogy, there's a kind of self-harm almost that people can engage in with through their ideals and their commitment to these lofty things. And he thought that was really bad and made you sick and all that
Mhm.
stuff.
Yeah.
So I kind of think that later Nietzsche, after Break with Wagner, maybe reflecting some on that, is a very humane kind of outlook, I think.
Mhm.
Um, and that's one thing I like about Nietzsche, at least in that text.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's a really good question. That's my 2 cents on it.
Mhm. Yeah, it's definitely a question that we kind of feel it differently every day, you know.
Right.
We have good days and we have bad days.
That's right. That's right.
Um,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. And I think Nietzsche in the genealogy is sort of saying that we need to understand things from multiple perspectives, not just from this sort of absolute all or nothing kind of commitment, right? So, yeah, yeah. So I have a question, if I may. So I've learned so much more about Wagner from your Facebook group and from this podcast, or the previous episode, and from just this conversation than I ever thought it was possible for me to
I don't
know.
know if people listen to the podcast.
Yeah. So I wonder, like, what are you, why are you guys interested in this project? What's kind of bringing you to think about Wagner in this really intensive way? Like you're really like diving into the details, not just listening to music, but like reading his works. So yeah. So tell me about that.
do you wanna hop on, Dan? I think we probably
Yeah,
want to
we were
keep this
just
to like
speaking about.
probably want to keep this to like, yeah,
Oh
four
yeah,
or five
oh yeah.
sentences if we can, because we
Well,
could go
I
on.
yeah, just going what we were talking about with idealism and sort of the flawed human practicality. It definitely started with flawed human practicality. Um, we had this idea for a recording project of music Wagner wouldn't like, and there were a lot of connections with the viola. So it was kind of like right there. And then it was like, okay, so we have an album that we can record, and how do we market it? Where can we spin off from this? And eventually we got, oh, well, we can approach Wagner via the things he didn't like. So that'll be our avenue into Wagner. So that's sort of the practical origin story. But there really has come about a more intentional and meaningful um, aspect to the project, for sure.
Yeah.
Um, for me, Wagner, he really wrestles with culture and all sorts of questions that we are still dealing with and always will be, I'm sure. And he had such a huge influence on our cultural inheritance, is part of our cultural inheritance, that when we deal with those questions, we have to deal with Wagner. Right? We really can't ignore it, because he
Mhm.
not only did he ask the same questions and in many cases have very good things and substantial things to say about them, but he also had a huge influence on
Mhm.
where we are now in regards to those questions and how we got to this point. So just a totally
Mhm.
unavoidable figure.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah,
That's really interesting. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think I think for me it's kind of riffing on a similar theme. It's that one of the big frustrations that I have with our kind of contemporary political, social conversation is just how black and white things are in terms of 100% agree, 100% disagree. And I really want to, I mean, life is in the gray area, you know? And there's just too many things are so contentious right now and so controversial when we talk about things that are actually going on right now that it's so intense, the language is so fiery that it's not even really a conversation almost. And so I think it's really useful to take somebody that is just as controversial and just as messed up, but with the remove of history, where we can talk about all these problems and understand all these contradictions that happen, that are there. They're just right before our eyes, these contradictions of awful person, amazing art, beautiful art, absolutely ridiculous, stupid pieces, full of contradictions. And that embracing contradictions and the gray area is something that I think is very lacking from what our current social conversation is able to handle.
Yeah, I think I'm really on board with both of what you guys have said about this, that a figure like Wagner, who did not only thought about the problems of culture, but like actually tried to do something about it and was somewhat successful in at least making a huge mark on it. Someone like that always is worth thinking about and studying, and precisely because you can kind of abstract from people's sort of passions about the hot button issues of today, right? Like a conversation about the state of Israel would go very differently than a conversation about Wagner and anti-Semitism, you know?
Totally.
And you could like get some traction with the historical figures to really think things through, you know? And so for me, that's what I like about teaching history of philosophy, especially, right? Because they all cared about the same stuff that we care about. Sometimes we have to ferret it out. And then we all see the glaring problems too, right there. And no one is like Descartes' nephew or cousin. Nobody's going to get mad if you don't like what he said, right? So, I think that both of those are really very understandable motivations. So that's great. That's really interesting.
Well, we have probably about 4 or 5 minutes left, and we just want to give you an opportunity here to plug anything that you're up to, or anything if people want to follow your work after this podcast, or kind of, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's great. So, I mean, I could tell you a little bit about what I'm working on that might be of interest to listeners, and I'm always up for conversations with people all the time. So, one thing I started working on last summer was thinking about a guy named Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, whose name you may have run across. He was important to German idealism. He wasn't a German idealist, but he was important to it because he was a fierce critic of the kind of rigid, rationalistic, neoclassicist in art kind of cultural paradigm that took over the Enlightenment era in Germany. And he was someone who was sort of a skeptic. And he was arguing, I think, for a view that says, no one's perfect, right? And the idea of perfection is actually kind of dangerous, and there's something wrong about it. And so he was a critic of the French Revolution in its excesses for that same reason, in a way that you guys are saying, right? Like, great idea. Do we have to chop off everybody's head? I don't know, right? But Jacobi was worried about stuff like that. So he himself was a writer, somewhat of a literary figure. He wrote a couple of novels. They're not very good, but they're sort of interesting. They're like novels about philosophy, right? And not in a good way, not like a Dostoevsky. but they're very interesting for philosophy. And the other thing I'm working on is Fichte. Like I said, I went to Chicago for the Fichte Society conference. And one of the things I'm really interested in is what Fichte has to say about how ethical life involves community, as opposed to it being just about like my personal conduct and, do I live up to my ideals? There's a sense in which Fichte thinks we're required to come together with other people and have sort of shared convictions on some level about what's good and what's right and what direction we should go in. And so he has some really interesting arguments that that's true. And then he also says some really weird stuff in there as well. And that's always true with these German philosophers. There's always like a really compelling argument, and then there's some kind of bizarre view, right? That like you can't understand how anyone would ever think that.
Yeah.
And so I'm working on that part of Fichte's philosophy now, kind of his social philosophy, and it relates to his views about religion as well, and the question of whether religion has a role in that kind of community unifying project. So yeah, that's what I'm into, and I'm always down to talk about philosophy, especially this stuff. It's kind of a sickness, as you can see. I don't know if podcast viewers will see this, but my office is really overloaded with books about German philosophy. So I'm always pumped to get to talk about it like this, for sure.
Well, great. Thank you
Yeah, we were
so
pumped to
much
have you.
for. Yeah, you've really brought another angle that few others could have
Yeah.
brought. So,
Yeah, well, great. Well, great. And it's really nice to meet you and nice to see you, Dan. I see you at
Mhm.
times, in the front of the church, right? But
At
not
times.
really a good time for conversations. So this is great. I'm going to keep listening to the podcast and keep following you guys on Facebook and learning more about Wagner all the while.
Thanks for tuning in for the Wagner's Nightmare podcast. Hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Ben Crowe. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and we got our website, and we have the Nightmare Verein with some extra music and stuff. And right now, at this very moment in time, up until Thursday, June 16th, we have our fundraiser campaign going to make the album, to get the actual music, because we are artists of Wagner's Nightmare. So we have an Indiegogo page. You can find that through our website. We also have a donate button on our website. So lots of ways to help out there. We are halfway to our goal of $15,000, which will cover everything for the album. So thanks again for listening and joining us in this journey into the nightmare of Wagner's mind.